Hey, you!
Me?
Yes, you! The loser with the Nintendo Switch!
Hey!
Are you trans?
Yeah, what gave it away?
Do you like video games?
Yeah, what gave it away?
You're the perfect person to take some time to learn about how being trans is viewed in Japan and how that is reflected in the video games they make.
That sounds really kind of hyper-specific, actually. Like you just did a college final and needed to drag someone...
Well, I guess if we're doing this, we're doing this. To start out my research, I figured it was best to get a basic grasp of how Japan views trans people and then look for how it's reflected in games. With this in mind, I started with the Rutledge Handbook of Sexual Studies in East Asia, particularly in Chapter 17, titled Sexual Minority Studies on Japan by Katsuhiko Suganuma. Digging into a section titled Other Voices, Transgenders, we see an outline of the development of trans identities in Japan dating back to the pre-modern period, with practices of cross-dressing primarily within the performing arts field. It also discusses the way that there are many male television celebrities who are notable for their cross-dressing and how, quote, instances of female-to-male cross-dressing have received less acknowledgement in historical or contemporary contexts, end quote. With these insights in mind, we can draw a parallel between Japanese and American culture. The way popular culture, and even within queer culture, trans men and drag kings are underrepresented. It's a weird nuance to think about when talking about an already marginalized group, but for whatever reason, in discussions of gender nonconformity, trans femmes and the more feminine presenting non-binaries tend to be overrepresented whilst trans masks are left in the dust. So let's connect it to gaming. To do that, we're going to have a look at Ultra Street Fighter 4 and Guilty Gear Strive, as well as another one of our sources. Let's get started with Street Fighter 4, which has been subject to some controversy in regards to its trans representation in general, but is a notable example because of the direct way that the conflicts between Japanese and American culture interacted in order to make the character trans. The character I'm referring to is Poison. She is the wrestling manager and handler for the heavyweight grappler Hugo, and an overly sexualized woman who can only really be described as a dominatrix of some kind. Poison is also an enemy in the Japanese beat-em-up game Final Fight, and the subject of controversy in her original series that carried over to her reappearance in the Street Fighter series of games. While she appeared in the Japanese version of Final Fight, she was ultimately replaced with a male enemy type in the American version of the game due to concerns about how the US players would react to beating up a woman. This culminated in Street Fighter 4, where Poison made a playable appearance. Yet again, the controversy of having to beat up a woman came to the forefront of developers' minds. Despite them having no reservations in regards to this for characters like Chun-Li and Cammy, and the devs made a decision. Well, they made a few, actually. First it was ambiguous, then she was trans, then she wasn't. Until finally, the game's producer, Yoshinori Ono, stated that, quote, in North America, Poison is officially post-op transgender, but in Japan, she simply tucks her business away to look female, end quote.
I'm sorry, what?
Needless to say, this is a hell of a way to explain her gender and oddly genitalia-centric, but it does aid an insight that we can look further into on Japanese views of transgenderism. The important thing to note is that she is Street Fighter's only confirmed transgender character, an overly sexualized woman, and only trans due to weird cultural stuff and technicalities imbued by the way that developers of the game speak about her, rather than her appearance or story within the games themselves. Then, there's the representation of Guilty Gear Strive, with Bridget and Testament, a trans woman and a non-binary person, respectively. One of these two is an example directly addressed in Liang's Analyzing Trans Misrepresentation in Video Games to Remediate Gender Dysphoria Triggers. That character is Bridget. Bridget has an odd and unique backstory of being a male who was raised as a girl alongside her twin brother in order to avoid the controversy that came with her hometown superstition that male twins would bring misfortune. Yeah, it ain't looking good for Guilty Gear. Now, by the time Strive rolls around, she's come to develop her identity as a woman outside of that reason, but it's still important to recognize the dubious way that she found herself in a position of presenting as trans, and that once she found out that identity for herself in Guilty Gear Strive, her design went from relatively realistic to an oddly cutesy and cis-passing woman. This component is the one that Liang focuses on the most in their article, as it primarily is addressing the ways that games trigger their players' gender dysphoria, and Bridget is absolutely the concept of passing pressure, pressure to pass as a cis person and not be visibly trans, personified. Passing pressure can often lead to feelings of inadequacy or even imposter syndrome among the people experiencing it. Then there's Testament, a character that has always been relatively androgynous right up until their appearance in Guilty Gear Strive. Coincidentally, or maybe not so coincidentally, marking the first game to note them as canonically non-binary. Also the first to give Testament a much more feminine frame and features, including an exaggerated set of boobs never seen on the character before this. It's an odd choice that speaks volumes about the developer's views on trans and gender non-conforming people by making both characters' designs far less androgynous than they were before their confirmed status as gender non-conforming. While Testament's change isn't mentioned in Liang's paper, it's an important note because it applies the same pressure that Bridget does to non-binary people. It perpetuates the idea that gender nonconformity still comes with a necessity to be feminine, dainty, or otherwise non-masculine, which simply isn't the case. This, paired with the knowledge we gained from Suganuma about male-to-female cross-dressing's prevalence in performing arts, and primarily as a spectacle in Japanese culture, is ultimately a relatively damning set of representations. But there's more to find here by talking about the Naoko Ogagami film, Rent-A-Cat.
Wait, actually?
I know it sounds absurd, but it has everything to do with the central theme of Rent-A-Cat, and that theme is one of rejecting societal norms to ultimately live a fulfilling life. Our main protagonist spends the whole film helping people fill the holes in their lives by renting out cats to them and ultimately helping people feel whole. All the while, she laments not having a love interest or being married or living up to the expectations of the society around her as represented by her nagging old lady neighbor, who may also be a representation of transness in media. She runs into incredulousness and concern at every turn of her journey. She runs into nagging, and most of all, she runs into her self-doubt. That feeling that maybe everyone else is right. Maybe she'd feel better if she had someone to love her, someone to be married to her, a wedding to plan, a honeymoon to enjoy traveling to Hawaii. Remember the passing pressure we were talking about earlier? This is that very same concept driven home in this film through the lens of the expectations placed upon women in Japanese society and those who are content to lead a life outside of the expected norms. It's an incredibly interesting piece that could help someone who's maybe having a difficult time understanding how tough passing pressure can be on a person by recontextualizing it outside of the trans experience. It can create a doorway for people to walk through and create a greater understanding. Which leads me back to our infamous transgender characters throughout the history of gaming, all of which had some connection to this pressure, this treatment as an oddity or novelty, this being a joke. There's the infamous first trans character in gaming, Birdo, from Super Mario Bros. 2, who was originally depicted as a character who simply thought they were a girl in the game's manual, and was portrayed as trans for a joke in Captain Rainbow, a Japan-only title for the Wii. These days, Birdo is depicted as the feminine counterpart to Yoshi, and not a single sign of her transness is present in games or their surrounding materials. Then there's Samus, who was once said to be trans in an interview, only for a dev to later claim that it was said as a joke and, quote, simply impossible. We've got the aforementioned pair of Poison and Bridget, who are absolutely difficult representation, though Bridget gets points for not being outright problematic or otherwise over-sexualized. And we've got Madeline in Celeste, who, well, actually, she isn't that problematic, but that's a nice exception. I don't mean to present gender nonconformity as represented by gaming as all doom and gloom. Nor do I mean to say Japan is lacking in acceptance. There are groups fighting for queer rights like Occur, and media is getting better. We see Hollow Knight's cast of primarily non-binary characters, Celeste's trans protagonist, where there's no odd emphasis around the way that she's treated. Hell, we even see Paper Mario, the Thousand Year Door's Vivian, whose narrative has always been that of self-acceptance and self-worth. It isn't all bad, but there's more to be done. There's a reason many of these characters have been trans women or non-binary folks, and that's because of the poor representation trans men get in the mainstream. Don't get me wrong, there are trans men out there in gaming, but they are far and few between, and our non-binary representation is mostly robots and bugs, or made overly feminine like Testament. It's a bit disappointing to see, but also an exciting challenge. There's more to be done to win this battle of representation for all, and we're just getting started on that climb.
And I mean, like, by pointing out all these issues, I'm not trying to condemn what has been done or make it seem like it's all doom and gloom, because there is good happening. There has been good done. It's more so to just encourage people to do more. Let's take on this challenge. We've made the start. Let's get to the rest, let's make some awesome games and some awesome media that represents people from all parts of the gender spectrum, from the most non-conforming of non-conformists to the most conforming to the binaries you can imagine. Let's get it all in there. I don't know. At the end of the day, let's just enjoy some video games or whatever. I'm just trans girl on the internet. What do I know?